There is a type of person that is very hard to control. They don't panic over every opinion. They don't change direction just because someone criticizes them. They don't believe everything they hear. They don't give away their peace over every provocation. And most importantly, they don't let fear, guilt, pressure, or approval make decisions for them. This person is not cold, not arrogant, not insensitive. They've simply developed something most people never build: inner command. Because the truth is this: most people are not manipulated because they are weak. They are manipulated because they react too fast. They feel before they think. They respond before they observe. They accept before they question. They trust before they test. And when someone lives in that state, they become predictable. And anything predictable can be controlled. Napoleon Hill taught in different ways that a mind without self-command becomes open territory for external influence. And in Outwitting the Devil, that idea becomes even clearer. A person who lives in drift doesn't realize they're being led. They believe they are choosing. But in reality, they are reacting to fear, reacting to pressure, reacting to other people's opinions, reacting to their environment, reacting to impulses in the moment. And then they call those reactions personality. They call it destiny. They say, "That's just who I am." But maybe that's not who they are. Maybe that's just who they've been conditioned to be. And if something was conditioned, it can be broken. In this video, you're going to discover the habits that make a person almost impossible to manipulate, not because they control others, but because they have learned to control themselves. You'll understand why some people remain steady while others are pulled by every emotion, why some don't fall under psychological pressure, why they don't trade their direction for approval, why they don't give their energy to negativity, and how they maintain clarity even when everything around them is trying to confuse their mind. Because a strong mind is not something you're born with. It's something you train, something you protect, something you discipline. And when you begin to develop these habits, something changes. You become harder to influence, harder to provoke, harder to distract, harder to weaken. And you start living from a place of internal strength that no one can take from you. So stay with me until the end. Because maybe your life is not stuck because you lack ability. Maybe it's stuck because too many things still have the power to pull you away from yourself. And the moment you learn how to return to your center, you begin to become free. Before we move forward, I want to invite you to do something simple but meaningful. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Here on Prosperity Laws, we study timeless principles of the mind, prosperity, and self-mastery. So you don't just desire a better life, you become the person capable of building it. And comment below, "My mind is under my command," because when your mind comes back under your command, manipulation loses its power. Now, let's begin. The invisible game of manipulation. Most people believe manipulation is obvious, something direct, something done to you intentionally and visibly. But that's not how it really works. The most dangerous manipulation is invisible. It doesn't force. It suggests. It doesn't impose. It influences. Until you believe the decision was yours. And that's exactly why it works so well. Because the moment you think you're choosing, you lower your guard. And when your guard is down, your mind becomes accessible. Today, manipulation doesn't come only from people. It comes from environments, from content, from conversations, from repeated patterns, from triggered emotions, and most of all, from a lack of awareness about all of it. No one needs to control you directly. They only need to influence how you think, and you'll act accordingly. This is the key point. Whoever controls your focus, controls your life. Because your focus determines what you notice. What you notice shapes what you feel. And what you feel drives how you act. Most people never realize this process is happening. They believe they are just being themselves, but often they are simply reacting to stimuli placed in front of them. An opinion that creates doubt, a headline that triggers fear, a comment that creates insecurity, a comparison that creates inferiority. All of it influences, all of it shapes, all of it directs decisions. And when you don't see it, you don't question it. And when you don't question it, you accept it. And when you accept it, you internalize it. And when you internalize it, it becomes part of who you think you are. That is the cycle. And that's why so many people live lives they never consciously chose. They were not forced. They were guided by emotions, by habits, by environment, by constant influence. Here's the hard truth. The less aware you are, the easier it is to manipulate you, because manipulation doesn't depend on force. It depends on access to your attention, access to your emotions, access to your mental patterns. And if you don't control that, something else will, not always directly, but enough to shape your choices. That's why, before you learn how to protect yourself, you need to understand that you are exposed, not as a victim, but as someone who hasn't yet built mental boundaries. And that awareness changes everything, because the moment you start observing, you begin to interrupt, you begin to question, you begin to reclaim space inside your own mind, and in that space, freedom begins to emerge. Now, if manipulation is this subtle, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why are some people so easy to influence, while others remain steady? And the answer reveals the next layer of this process. Why most people are so easy to manipulate. Why most people are easy to manipulate. If manipulation is subtle, why do so many people fall into it so easily? The answer is not lack of intelligence. It's lack of internal control. Most people don't lose control of their lives all at once. They lose it in small, unnoticed moments. Moments where they react instead of observe. Moments where they follow emotion instead of thinking. Moments where they accept something without questioning it. And when this becomes a pattern, manipulation becomes easy, because manipulation doesn't need to fight resistance. It only needs to follow your tendencies. One of the biggest reasons people are easy to influence is this. They are emotionally reactive. They feel something and immediately act on it. No pause, no analysis, no distance. A comment triggers anger. A situation triggers fear. A comparison triggers insecurity. And from that emotion, decisions are made. But here's the problem. Emotion is the easiest thing to manipulate. If someone can control how you feel, they can influence how you act. And if they can influence how you act, they can influence the direction of your life. Another reason is the need for approval. Many people don't live based on truth. They live based on acceptance. They adjust their behavior to fit in. They silence their thoughts to avoid judgment. They follow trends to avoid rejection. And slowly, they lose their independence. Because once approval becomes a priority, truth becomes secondary. And when truth becomes secondary, your direction is no longer yours. There is also a deeper factor, lack of purpose. When a person doesn't know what they want, they become open to anything. Any opinion sounds relevant. Any path seems possible. Any distraction becomes attractive. And without direction, influence becomes stronger than intention. This creates a dangerous condition. A mind without structure. A mind that reacts to whatever appears. A mind that adapts to pressure. A mind that follows instead of leading. And that is the perfect environment for manipulation. Because there is no resistance, no filter, no internal authority, just external input, shaping everything. Another key element is mental laziness. Not in the sense of effort, but in the sense of thinking. Questioning requires energy. Analyzing requires effort. Observing requires awareness. And most people avoid that, so they accept things quickly. They believe things easily. They adopt ideas without testing them. And every time that happens, their mind becomes more programmable. Understand this clearly. Manipulation works best on a passive mind. A mind that doesn't question. A mind that doesn't pause. A mind that doesn't observe itself. But the moment awareness increases, everything changes, because awareness creates distance. Distance between stimulus and response. Distance between emotion and action. Distance between influence and identity. And in that distance, you gain control. That is what separates people who are easily influenced from those who remain grounded. Not intelligence, not knowledge, but awareness. Control over attention. Control over reaction. Control over decision. So here is the question. How often do you react without thinking? How often do you accept without questioning? How often do you adjust just to fit in? Because every one of those moments is an opening, an entry point, a place where influence becomes control. But once you start closing those openings, your mind becomes harder to access, harder to influence, harder to manipulate. And that's where real strength begins. Now that you understand why most people are vulnerable, it's time to move to the other side. What actually makes a person impossible to manipulate? The habits. Habit 1. Clarity of purpose. If a lack of purpose makes a person vulnerable, clarity of purpose makes them difficult to control. This is where everything begins. Because a person who knows exactly what they want becomes harder to influence. Not because they are rigid, but because they are directed. Without direction, the mind is open. It absorbs everything. Every opinion feels relevant. Every opportunity feels tempting. Every distraction feels acceptable. But with direction, something changes. A filter is created. Not everything gets in. Not everything deserves attention. Not everything deserves energy. And that filter protects your mind. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill makes it clear that people without a definite purpose are the easiest to lead, because they don't know where they're going. So any direction feels like movement. Any influence feels like guidance. Any voice feels like authority. That is how manipulation enters. Through the absence of clarity, when there is no internal command, external voices become louder. But the moment you define a clear purpose, those voices lose power. Because now, every idea is measured. Every decision is evaluated. Every influence is tested, not based on emotion, but based on alignment. Does this move me forward? Does this support my direction? Does this strengthen what I'm building? If the answer is no, it is rejected. That is the shift from reaction to selection. People without purpose react to what appears. People with purpose select what matters. And that difference changes everything. Because manipulation depends on distraction, on confusion, on emotional reaction. But purpose creates stability. It creates focus. It creates resistance. A person with a clear purpose doesn't get easily pulled into unnecessary debates, doesn't get lost in every new idea, doesn't follow every trend, because their attention is anchored. And attention is power. Whoever controls your attention controls your life. But when your attention is anchored in purpose, it becomes difficult to redirect, difficult to steal, difficult to manipulate. Understand this clearly. Purpose is not just a goal. It is a mental structure. It organizes your thoughts. It guides your decisions. It protects your focus. And without it, everything becomes noise. So here is the question. What is directing your life right now? Is it a clear intention or whatever happens to appear? Because if you don't define your direction, something else will define it for you. And once that happens, you are no longer leading, you are following. But the moment you take ownership of your purpose, you stop being easily influenced. You stop being pulled in every direction. You stop being controlled by external forces. And you begin to move with clarity. Now that you understand the first habit, the next one goes deeper, because even with purpose, there is something that can still expose you. Your level of awareness, self-awareness. Habit 2, constant self-awareness. Clarity of purpose gives direction. But without awareness, you can still be pulled off that path. Self-awareness is what keeps you anchored. It is the ability to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and reactions in real time. Not after the fact. Not when the damage is already done, but in the moment. Because manipulation doesn't begin with control. It begins with a reaction, a feeling, a trigger. And if you don't notice that moment, you're already inside the influence. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill points out that people who drift are often unaware of their own mental patterns. They don't see how they react. They don't question why they feel what they feel. They don't examine the thoughts that pass through their mind. They simply experience and act. And that lack of awareness creates vulnerability. Because if you don't observe your reactions, you can't interrupt them. And if you can't interrupt them, you repeat them over and over again. This is how patterns are formed. Someone says something, you feel triggered. You react. Later, you justify it. And the next time, it happens again. No pause, no reflection, no change. That is the cycle. But self-awareness breaks that cycle because it creates space. Space between what happens and how you respond. And in that space, you gain power. You start to notice things. You notice when something triggers you. You notice when your emotions rise. You notice when your thoughts shift. And instead of immediately reacting, you observe. You question. You decide. That is the difference between being controlled and being conscious. Most people live on autopilot. They feel something and act. They think something and believe it. They hear something and accept it. There is no filter, no pause, no awareness. And without awareness, everything goes through. But a self-aware mind is different. It doesn't accept everything automatically. It examines, it questions, it filters. It chooses. That makes it harder to influence, harder to manipulate, because manipulation depends on unconscious reactions. It depends on speed, on impulse, on lack of reflection. But awareness slows everything down. It creates clarity. It creates control. It allows you to step back and see what is really happening, not just externally, but internally. And that is where true protection begins. Because once you can see your own patterns, you can change them. You are no longer a prisoner of your reactions. You become the observer of them. And from that position, you gain authority over your own mind. So here's the question. How often do you actually observe your own reactions? How often do you pause before responding? How often do you question your own thoughts? Because every moment of awareness is a moment of freedom. And every moment without awareness is an opening for influence. The more aware you become, the less predictable you are. And the less predictable you are, the harder it is to manipulate you. Now that you understand this habit, the next one reveals the core mechanism behind almost all manipulation: emotion, emotional control. Habit 3, emotional control self-awareness allows you to see what is happening. Emotional control allows you to decide what happens next. Because almost every form of manipulation begins in the same place. Your emotions, not your logic, not your reasoning. Your emotions, fear, anger, desire, insecurity, urgency. These are the entry points. And the moment one of these emotions takes control, your ability to think clearly starts to weaken. That is not a flaw. It is how the mind works. But when it is not managed, it becomes a vulnerability. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill makes it clear that people who cannot control their emotional reactions are the easiest to influence, because emotion creates immediacy. It creates pressure. It creates the need to act now. And when there is urgency, there is no space for reflection. That is where manipulation becomes effective. Someone triggers your anger, you react. Someone creates fear, you withdraw. Someone stimulates desire, you chase. Someone creates insecurity, you seek validation. And in every one of those moments, your behavior is being guided, not by your intention, but by your emotional state. This is the core problem. An emotional mind is a reactive mind, and a reactive mind is predictable. If someone knows what triggers you, they can predict how you will respond. And if they can predict your response, they can influence your actions. That is how subtle control works. Not by forcing you, but by triggering you. So emotional control is not about suppressing what you feel. It is about not being controlled by it, because emotions will always exist. You will feel anger. You will feel fear. You will feel pressure. You will feel desire. The difference is what you do in that moment. Most people feel and act. People with emotional control feel and pause. That pause changes everything, because in that pause, you create distance. Distance between the emotion and the decision. And in that distance, logic returns. Clarity returns. Choice returns. This is where power begins. Because now, instead of reacting automatically, you choose your response. You ask, what am I feeling right now? Why am I feeling this? Is this emotion helping me or controlling me? That simple questioning interrupts the pattern. It breaks the automatic response. It puts you back in control. And over time, this becomes a habit. You no longer react instantly. You no longer get pulled by every trigger. You no longer allow external stimuli to dictate your behavior. You become stable, grounded, centered. And that stability makes you difficult to manipulate. Because manipulation depends on emotional spikes, on sudden reactions, on impulsive decisions. But when your emotional state is regulated, those entry points begin to close. Someone tries to provoke you. You don't react. Someone tries to pressure you. You don't rush. Someone tries to create fear. You don't collapse. That changes the dynamic completely. Because now, instead of being influenced, you are observing. Instead of being pulled, you are anchored. Instead of being controlled, you are choosing. Understand this clearly. Emotional control is not about becoming cold. It is about becoming stable. Stable enough to feel without losing direction. Stable enough to experience emotion without surrendering control. Stable enough to respond instead of react. And that stability is what protects your mind. So here is the question. What emotions control your behavior the most? Anger? Fear? The need for approval? The desire for immediate pleasure? Because whatever you cannot control can be used against you. But once you learn to manage your emotional state, you close one of the biggest doors manipulation uses to enter. Now, even with emotional control, there is another layer that determines how you process what you receive, how you interpret information, how you decide what is true and what is not. Critical thinking. Habit 4. Critical thinking emotional control protects your reactions, but critical thinking protects your decisions. Because even if you don't react impulsively, you can still accept the wrong idea. And once an idea is accepted, it begins to shape everything. How you see the world, how you interpret situations, how you make decisions, and ultimately how you live. This is where most people become vulnerable, not because they feel too much, but because they question too little. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill reinforces a powerful principle. A mind that does not think for itself will always be influenced by others. Because if you don't examine what enters your mind, you automatically accept it. And what you accept becomes part of you. That is how manipulation scales. Not through force, but through unchallenged ideas. Most people hear something and believe it. They see something and assume it's true. They read something and internalize it without testing it. There is no pause, no analysis, no verification, just absorption. And that creates a dangerous pattern, a programmable mind, a mind that adopts beliefs quickly, a mind that follows narratives easily, a mind that can be shaped without resistance. Critical thinking breaks that pattern because it creates friction. It slows down acceptance. It introduces questions, and those questions act as a filter. Instead of asking, "Is this interesting?" you begin asking, "Is this true?" Instead of asking, "Do I like this?" you begin asking, "Does this make sense?" Instead of asking, "Everyone is saying this," you begin asking, "Why are they saying this?" That shift changes everything, because now ideas don't enter freely. They are examined, tested, evaluated, and only then accepted or rejected. This makes your mind harder to influence, because manipulation depends on speed, on emotional appeal, on repetition without questioning. But critical thinking interrupts all of that. It forces you to slow down, to analyze, to separate facts from interpretation. And that separation is crucial, because many things presented as facts are actually opinions. Many things presented as truth are actually perspective. Many things presented as certainty are actually incomplete. But without questioning, everything feels real. And once it feels real, it begins to guide your actions. Understand this clearly. You don't become difficult to manipulate by knowing more. You become difficult to manipulate by thinking better, by not accepting everything automatically, by not trusting everything immediately, by not following everything blindly. People with strong critical thinking don't reject everything. They simply don't accept everything. They evaluate. They reflect. They decide. That gives them independence. Independence from trends, from narratives, from external pressure. And that independence creates strength, because now your mind is not easily shaped by what is around you. It is guided by what you have examined. So here is the question. How often do you actually question what you hear? How often do you analyze what you believe? How often do you challenge your own assumptions? Because every unexamined idea is a potential point of influence, and every examined idea strengthens your control. Now, even with critical thinking, there is another force that quietly influences behavior, one that makes people abandon their own truth just to be accepted. The need for approval, detachment from other people's opinions. Habit 5. Detachment from other people's opinions. Critical thinking protects what enters your mind, but there is something that can still override everything. The need for approval. Because even when you know what is true, even when you think clearly, even when you see through influence, you can still abandon your direction just to be accepted. This is one of the most subtle forms of manipulation. No one forces you. No one controls you directly, but the fear of rejection does the work for them. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill emphasizes that fear of criticism is one of the strongest forces shaping human behavior. Because once a person becomes dependent on approval, they stop being independent. And when independence is lost, influence takes over. Think about it. How many times have you held back your opinion? Not because it was wrong, but because it might be judged. How many times have you changed your behavior, not because you wanted to, but because you wanted to fit in? How many decisions were made, not based on truth, but based on how they would be perceived? This is how manipulation happens at a deeper level, not through force, but through social pressure, through the desire to belong, through the fear of standing out. And over time, this creates a pattern. You start filtering yourself, adjusting your behavior, suppressing your thoughts, all to maintain acceptance. And slowly, you lose alignment with yourself, because now your decisions are no longer based on what is right, but on what is approved. And that is a dangerous position, because approval is unstable. It changes. It shifts. It depends on people, context, and expectations. If your direction depends on that, your life becomes unstable too. People who are difficult to manipulate understand something critical. Approval is not a reliable compass. They don't ignore feedback. They don't reject all opinions, but they don't depend on them. They listen, but they decide. They observe, but they choose. They remain open, but not controlled. That is the difference between being influenced and being guided. Detachment from opinion doesn't mean isolation. It means independence. It means your decisions are not dictated by external validation. It means your identity is not shaped by how others see you, and that gives you stability. Because now you are anchored internally, not externally. Someone criticizes you. You evaluate it, but you don't collapse. Someone disagrees. You consider it, but you don't abandon your direction. Someone rejects you. You feel it, but you don't change who you are. That level of stability makes manipulation difficult, because manipulation often uses social pressure as a tool. If you don't do this, you'll be judged. If you don't follow this, you'll be excluded. If you don't agree, you'll be different. And for most people, that is enough to make them conform. But when you are detached from that need, those tools lose power. Understand this clearly. The moment you need approval to act, you become dependent, and dependency creates vulnerability. But the moment you act based on your own standards, you become stable, and stability creates resistance. So here is the question. How much of your life is being shaped by what others think? How many choices are influenced by the desire to be accepted? Because every time you choose approval over truth, you move further away from your own direction. But every time you choose alignment over acceptance, you strengthen your independence. And independence is what makes you difficult to control. Now, even with independence, there is another factor that determines how easily your attention can be pulled. Your discipline, mental discipline. Habit 6, mental discipline. Detachment from other people's opinions gives you independence. But without discipline, your attention can still be stolen. And attention is the primary target of manipulation, because whoever controls your attention controls your direction. Most people don't lose control of their lives in one moment. They lose it in fragments. A distraction here, a scroll there, a thought interrupted, a focus broken. And over time, their attention becomes scattered. And a scattered mind is an easy mind to control. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill highlights that a mind without discipline is easily influenced by external forces, because it doesn't stay focused long enough to build anything meaningful. It reacts, it shifts, it follows whatever captures its attention in the moment. And that is exactly how influence works today. Not by controlling what you think directly, but by controlling what you keep seeing, what you keep consuming, what you keep focusing on, because repetition shapes belief, and belief shapes action. So if your attention is constantly being redirected, your thinking is constantly being shaped, without you realizing it. This is the trap. Lack of mental discipline creates a mind that cannot stay with one idea long enough to question it or build something from it. It jumps from stimulus to stimulus, from idea to idea, from emotion to emotion. And in that constant movement, there is no depth, no clarity, no control. People who are difficult to manipulate understand something most ignore. Focus is a form of protection. When you decide what deserves your attention, you reduce external influence. When you control what you consume, you control what enters your mind. When you maintain focus, you strengthen your internal authority. Mental discipline is not just about productivity. It is about control. Control over where your attention goes. Control over what you engage with. Control over what you allow to shape your thinking. Without that control, everything competes for your mind. Notifications, opinions, content, noise, and most of it is not neutral. It is designed to capture, hold, and redirect your attention, because attention is valuable, and whoever captures it influences you. So discipline begins with a simple shift. You stop reacting to everything. You stop consuming everything. You stop engaging with everything. You become selective, intentional, focused. You decide, this deserves my attention. This does not. That decision creates boundaries, and boundaries protect your mind. At first, it feels uncomfortable, because the mind is used to stimulation, used to constant input, used to distraction. But over time, something changes. Focus becomes stronger, clarity increases, thinking becomes deeper, and your mind becomes harder to influence, because now it is not open to everything. It is directed, and direction creates resistance. So here's the question. Who is controlling your attention right now? Is it you or everything around you? Because every moment your attention is taken without intention, you lose a piece of control. But every moment you direct it consciously, you strengthen your mind, and the stronger your focus, the harder it becomes to manipulate you. Now, even with discipline over attention, there is another factor that silently shapes your thinking, something that influences you even when you're not aware of it: your environment. Habit 7. Selective environment mental discipline protects your attention. But there is something that shapes your mind even when you're not paying attention: your environment. Not just the physical space you live in, but the psychological space you exist in every day. The people around you, the conversations you hear, the content you consume, the energy you are exposed to. Because even when you are focused, you are still absorbing, and what you absorb slowly becomes how you think. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill reinforces a critical idea. A mind without conscious protection will adapt to its environment. Not occasionally, continuously, silently, automatically. This is what makes environments so powerful. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't announce its influence. It simply repeats until it becomes normal. And once something feels normal, it stops being questioned. That is where manipulation becomes invisible. Because now, influence doesn't feel like influence. It feels like reality. Think about how many beliefs people carry that they never chose. That's just how things are. That's not for people like me. That's impossible. These ideas were not created consciously. They were absorbed, repeated, reinforced, until they became truth. But they are not truth. They are environment. And environment shapes perception. Perception shapes decisions. And decisions shape life. This is why two people can live in completely different realities, even if they have similar potential. One is surrounded by growth, ambition, clarity. The other is surrounded by limitation, doubt, and distraction. And over time, they begin to reflect those environments. Because the mind adapts, always. People who are difficult to manipulate understand something most ignore. They don't just control their thoughts. They control what feeds their thoughts. They become selective, not paranoid, not isolated, but intentional. They pay attention to who they spend time with, because conversations influence thinking. They pay attention to what they consume, because content shapes perception. They pay attention to what they repeat, because repetition builds belief. And that awareness creates protection, because instead of being passively influenced, they actively choose their inputs. They ask, is this expanding my thinking or limiting it? Is this strengthening me or weakening me? Is this aligned with who I want to become? If the answer is no, they reduce exposure because they understand something powerful. You don't need to fight negative influence if you stop feeding it. And this is where most people struggle. They try to change their mindset while staying in the same environment. They try to grow while surrounded by the same patterns. They try to think differently while consuming the same inputs. And that creates conflict because your intention is moving forward, but your environment is pulling you back. And over time, the environment usually wins unless you change it. Now, this doesn't always mean changing everything externally. You may not be able to change your surroundings immediately, but you can begin to change your exposure. What you listen to, what you watch, what you read, what you repeat internally. These choices start to reshape your mental environment. And over time, they influence how you think, how you decide, how you act. This is how transformation begins, not through force, but through consistent exposure to better inputs. So here is the question. What is shaping your mind right now? Is your environment reinforcing growth or reinforcing limitation? Is it pushing you forward or keeping you where you are? Because whatever surrounds you consistently will eventually define you. And if you don't choose your environment will choose your direction. Now, even with the right environment, there is another factor that determines how you act. Because you can think clearly, you can see clearly, but still fail to move. And that comes down to one thing: your ability to decide and act. Decisiveness. Habit 8. Decisive action. A strong environment supports your thinking. But thinking alone does not protect you, because you can see clearly and still not move. You can understand everything and still remain in the same place. That is where decisiveness becomes critical, because hesitation creates openings, and every opening invites influence. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill repeatedly connects drifting with the absence of firm decisions, not because people don't know what to do, but because they delay acting on what they already know. And in that delay, doubt grows. Other voices enter. Opinions accumulate. Fear intensifies. And what was once clear becomes uncertain. This is how manipulation regains control, not through force, but through hesitation. A decisive person closes that window. They don't wait for perfect conditions. They don't wait for complete certainty. They make a call and move. And that movement changes the dynamic, because once you act, you shift from passive to active, from influenced to directing, from reacting to creating. Decisiveness is not about always being right. It is about not staying stuck. People who are difficult to manipulate don't spend endless time in internal debate. They gather enough clarity and commit. They understand that clarity increases through action, not before it. This is where most people get trapped. They believe they need certainty first, but certainty rarely comes without movement. So they wait, and while they wait, their mind becomes crowded. What if this doesn't work? What if there's a better option? What if I make the wrong choice? Those questions multiply, and instead of moving forward, they stay frozen. That is the trap, because indecision creates mental noise, and mental noise weakens control. But decisiveness simplifies everything. You choose a direction. You move. You adjust along the way. And that keeps your mind clean, focused, aligned. Another key point, decisiveness builds self-trust. Every time you make a decision and follow through, you prove to yourself that you can rely on your own judgment. And that trust reduces dependence on others. You stop needing constant validation. You stop seeking endless opinions. You stop waiting for approval because you trust your ability to decide. And that independence makes you harder to influence because manipulation often enters through doubt. If someone can make you question yourself, they can redirect you. But when your decisions are firm, external voices lose power. They can still speak, but they don't override you. Understand this clearly. A person who cannot decide can be directed. A person who decides becomes difficult to control. So decisiveness is not just a productivity skill. It is a defense mechanism. It protects your direction. It protects your momentum. It protects your identity. So here is the question. How long do you stay in doubt before acting? How many decisions are you delaying right now? How often do you wait instead of moving? Because every delay creates space for influence, and every decision closes that space. The faster you decide with awareness, the less time influence has to enter. Now, even with decisiveness, there is another layer that determines how you interpret your life. Because you can act, but still place the responsibility outside yourself. And that creates a different kind of vulnerability. Responsibility. Habit 9. Total responsibility. Decisiveness moves you forward. But responsibility determines who is in control of your life. Because you can make decisions, you can take action, you can even move consistently, and still give your power away. How? By placing the cause of your life outside of you. Blaming circumstances. Blaming people. Blaming the past. Blaming the system. Blaming timing. Blaming luck. At first, it feels justified. Sometimes those factors are real. But the effect is always the same. You lose control. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill makes a crucial point. People who drift often refuse to take full responsibility for their thoughts and actions. And when responsibility is avoided, control is surrendered. Because if something outside of you is responsible, then something outside of you must change. And that puts your life on hold. Waiting, expecting, hoping, but not acting from power. This is where manipulation becomes easier. Because a person who sees themselves as a victim is easier to influence, easier to direct, easier to control. Why? Because they are not operating from ownership. They are operating from reaction, from dependency, from external validation. They believe life happens to them instead of being shaped by them. And that belief changes everything. Because now, instead of asking, "What can I do?" they ask, "Why is this happening to me?" Instead of acting, they explain. Instead of adjusting, they justify. Instead of moving, they wait. And waiting creates vulnerability, because while you wait for things to change, you are open to influence, open to opinions, open to narratives, open to anything that promises relief. But when you take full responsibility, that dynamic shifts completely. You stop looking outward for answers. You start looking inward for control. You begin to ask different questions. What part of this is in my control? What can I change right now? What can I improve? What decision do I need to make? That shift creates power, because now, regardless of the situation, you have a point of action, a point of movement, a point of control. Responsibility is not about blame. It is about ownership. Ownership of your thoughts. Ownership of your reactions. Ownership of your decisions. Ownership of your direction. And once you take ownership, You stop being easily influenced because you are no longer waiting for others to define your path. You define it, even in difficult situations, even when things are not ideal, even when conditions are not perfect. You still act, you still adjust, you still move. That makes you resilient. And resilience makes you difficult to manipulate, because manipulation often uses external pressure. It tells you, this is your fault. This is not your fault. This is because of them. This is because of that. It tries to redirect your perception. But when you take responsibility, you don't get pulled into that. You evaluate. You decide. You act. That keeps you grounded, stable, in control. Understand this clearly. The moment you give away responsibility, you give away power. But the moment you take it back, you regain control. So here is the question. How much of your life are you still placing outside of yourself? What are you blaming instead of owning? What are you waiting to change before you move? Because every area where you avoid responsibility is an area where influence can enter, but every area where you take ownership becomes protected. Now, even with responsibility, there is one final layer, the deepest one of all, because it determines how stable you remain. No matter what happens, your identity, a strong identity. Habit 10. A strong identity responsibility gives you control. But identity determines how stable that control remains. Because even if you think clearly, act decisively, and take ownership, you can still be influenced if you don't know who you are. Identity is the foundation. It is the internal definition that guides everything else. Your decisions, your standards, your boundaries, your behavior. And when that definition is weak, it becomes flexible, easily shaped, easily adjusted, easily influenced. In Outwitting the Devil, Napoleon Hill makes it clear that people who drift often lack a strong sense of self. They don't have a fixed internal standard, so they adapt to whatever environment they are in. With one group, they think one way. With another, they change. In one situation, they act one way. In another, they adjust. This flexibility may look like adaptation, but often it is instability, because there is no core, no anchor, no internal reference point. And without that, identity is shaped externally, by opinions, by expectations, by pressure, by trends. This is where manipulation reaches its deepest level, not by changing what you do, but by shaping who you believe you are. Because once identity shifts, everything else follows. A person who believes, I am not confident, will act accordingly. A person who believes, I am easily influenced, will behave accordingly. A person who believes, this is not for me, will never pursue it. These beliefs are not facts. They are adopted identities, repeated thoughts, turned into self-definition. And once something becomes part of your identity, it feels permanent. But it is not. It is constructed. And what is constructed can be reconstructed. People who are difficult to manipulate have something different. They have a strong internal identity, not based on external validation, not based on temporary emotions, but based on chosen standards. They know who they are. They know what they stand for. They know what they do and what they don't do. And that clarity creates stability. Because now, decisions are not random. They are aligned. Choices are not reactive. They are consistent. Behavior is not influenced. It is directed. Someone pressures them. They don't change. Someone criticizes them. They don't collapse. Someone tries to influence them. They don't absorb it blindly because they have a reference point, an internal standard. And that standard acts as protection. This is what makes identity so powerful. It removes uncertainty. It removes inconsistency. It removes vulnerability. Because now, instead of asking, "What should I do in this situation?" you already know. Not because the situation is simple, but because your standards are clear. Understand this clearly. A weak identity adapts to pressure. A strong identity filters it. And that filter makes manipulation difficult because influence depends on uncertainty, on doubt, on flexibility without direction. But identity creates certainty. It creates boundaries. It creates resistance. So here's the question. How clear is your identity right now? Do you know what you stand for? Do you know your standards? Or do you adapt depending on the situation? Because every area where your identity is unclear is an area where influence can shape you. But every area where your identity is defined becomes protected. And once identity becomes strong, your mind becomes stable. Your decisions become consistent. Your direction becomes clear. And your life becomes difficult to control. Now that you understand all the habits, there is one final step. Because knowledge alone is not enough. You need to integrate it, you need to apply it, and you need to make a decision. To take control. Becoming impossible to manipulate, you've now seen the habits, not as theories, but as structures that protect your mind. Clarity of purpose, self-awareness, emotional control, critical thinking, detachment from approval, mental discipline, a selective environment, decisive action, total responsibility, a strong identity. Individually, each one strengthens you. Together, they transform you. Because this is not about learning how to resist manipulation in isolated moments. It's about becoming the kind of person who is no longer easily influenced. Someone whose mind is not open to everything, not reactive to everything, not shaped by everything. This is where true freedom begins. Not external freedom, internal freedom. The ability to think clearly, even under pressure. The ability to decide, even in uncertainty. The ability to remain stable, even when everything around you is unstable. Most people don't realize this. But manipulation only works when there is something inside you that responds to it. A trigger, a weakness, a gap. And each of these habits closes those gaps. Purpose closes confusion. Awareness closes unconscious reactions. Emotional control closes impulsive behavior. Critical thinking closes blind acceptance. Detachment closes approval dependency. Discipline closes distraction. Environment control closes silent influence. Decisiveness closes hesitation. Responsibility closes victim mentality. Identity closes instability. And when those gaps are closed, manipulation has nowhere to enter. This is the shift. From being influenced to being grounded. From being reactive to being intentional. From being controlled to being in command. But this transformation doesn't happen all at once. It happens through repetition, through daily choices, through small decisions that reinforce who you are becoming. Because every time you choose awareness, you strengthen control. Every time you choose discipline, you strengthen focus. Every time you choose truth over approval, you strengthen identity. And over time, that becomes your default. That becomes your nature. That becomes who you are. So this is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming conscious. Because once you are conscious, you stop operating on autopilot. You stop being predictable. You stop being easily influenced. And you start living by design. Now, here is the question that matters. Are you living from your own mind? Or from everything that influences it? Are your choices truly yours? Or are they reactions shaped by what surrounds you? Because the difference between those two states is the difference between control and freedom. And the moment you see that clearly is the moment you can begin to change it. So don't try to apply everything at once. Start with one habit, strengthen it, Make it consistent. Then move to the next, because transformation is built step by step. And every step you take with awareness moves you further away from influence and closer to control. Now, before you leave this video, make a decision, not a temporary one, a conscious one. Go into the comments and write, "My mind is under my command," because that is not just a phrase. It is a declaration, a standard, a direction. And the more you repeat that with action, the more it becomes real. If this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Here on Prosperity Laws, we don't just talk about mindset. We train it, we strengthen it, we protect it. So you don't just understand these principles, you live them. And remember, your life changes the moment your mind stops being influenced and starts being directed. That is where power begins.